Okay, so welcome. Let's get started. The good news for me, at least, is that apparently it wasn't my fault that the video wasn't showing. So if any of you have been looking at Mulo, unfortunately for the last 2 weeks there have been only audio recordings in quite mixed quality, but no video recordings because it wasn't. It was supposed to be picking up from the projector, but it wasn't. So they're looking into that, and hopefully next week that will be solved. For the meantime, I'm just going to work with the alternative computer, and I hope that that works, but apparently it's not guaranteed either. So sorry if it doesn't. We're doing our best on this. Okay, so then just a very quick review of what we did last week. So we looked at different kinds of valid and invalid arguments. First of all, we had a couple of technical definitions. So if you remember, we had said that validity is exactly an argument that is truth-preserving. So where true premises provide good reasons for also thinking that the conclusion is true, and exactly that's what an invalid argument, where an invalid argument fails, it does not give you good reasons to accept the conclusion even if the premises are true. And then we distinguish different types of validity and invalidity. And just to remind you of this at all, we had said that validity is just one ingredient for soundness. So a truly sound or successful argument is going to have to be both valid, is going to both have to have valid form, a certain valid structure, and we'll be looking at that in more detail today, and it will also have to have all true premises. So those were kind of the technical terms to keep in mind. These were the two types of validity that we distinguished. Most arguments that we'll be looking at today are going to be deductively valid. So here, a true conclusion is absolutely guaranteed to follow from true premises. There is no way in a deductively valid argument that a false conclusion could follow from true premises. Inductive validity is a bit weaker, so that's a matter of probability, and there at that point things get messy. So how probable is probable enough? In a inductively valid argument, we will still have the kind of form, the kind of relationship between the premises and the conclusions that makes it more or less likely that a true conclusion will follow from true premises, but there could be cases in which this does not occur, in which we still have valid form, but the improbable case occurs and the conclusion is nonetheless false. So here what we're looking at is a true conclusion guaranteed to follow from true premises, but just does the form of the argument make this likely? Most empirical, most scientific arguments, most arguments about facts in the world are actually going to be of this sort. So those are the ones that are interesting. Those are also the ones that are confusing. So for purposes of argument, we'll be mostly focusing on deductively valid arguments, at least for this week. And we'll be looking a bit more at this here later on in the semester. So that's just the quick summary of what we've done so far. And snap judgment, what about this one? What's going on here? All roses are flowers, some flowers fade quickly, therefore some roses fade quickly. Who says it's valid? Who says it's invalid? Okay, a couple people don't say anything. That's fine. So that's an illusion of validity, right? So we do have true premises and true conclusions. That makes us somewhat likely to accept the conclusion, but there is no support. So that's exactly the kind of phenomenon that one would call my-side bias. Either you were actually really good at this, or you've already begun to read my psychology and seeing that I ask you misleading questions. So most of you got this right, which is great. However, to make things easier, we're going to be looking at kind of standard cookie-cutter examples of how we can tell what are the actual forms, what is the recipe for always generating deductively valid arguments, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to be looking at a bit on biases in assessing support, my side, and confirmation bias, and then we'll exactly be looking at various deductively valid forms. And I will have more on these slides than I can cover, so you will see that I'll be clicking just past quite a few things. Those are just kind of additional things to look at home. Also exercises to look at home if you want. Final reminder, AT1 is due on Wednesday, so unless you've asked me for an extension or asked or applied for special consideration, that definitely needs to be in. Okay, all good at this point? Good. So, my side bias, and we'll have a long lecture at the very end about cognitive illusions and biases in critical thinking, but this is kind of the most problematic one, and one you've already heard about. And this is where the psychology of critical thinking actually messes with our ability to engage in good critical thinking, right? So it seems that exactly judgments of validity are typically systematically biased in favor of what one actually already accepts for independent reasons. And this is especially true if you already have strong feelings or if you have high stakes in accepting a conclusion. So exactly those types of arguments that are extremely important for you, for whatever reasons, personally, professionally, are also going to be harder to assess in terms of their structure. That's just the way we humans work. And the scary thing is that if you fall victim to my side bias, this is not an indicator of low intelligence, right? So this kind of sickness in critical thinking actually affects people independent of their cognitive ability and their intelligence, and also independently of their expertise. So this is the kind of thing where you can even get experts all messed up on their very own topics. Might be a fun party game, but it's also a problem for assessment tasks, for instance. So that's why we're looking at it. It's not a new thing, so it is a psychological finding. So it is kind of a strategy and reasoning that has been known for a very long time. So here's Francis Bacon saying something very similar, right? So the human understanding, when it has once adopted an opinion, either as being a received opinion or as being agreeable to itself, draws all things else to support and agree with it. And here he's actually saying something a bit more, right, than my side bias itself. So my side bias itself just says we're biased in accepting conclusions that we already take to be true or rejecting conclusions that we already independently take to be false and not evaluating the argument itself. Here he's telling us, well, but in addition, then we also go out and hunt for the types of evidence that will make it seem as if exactly those opinions and convictions we're so attached to were more strongly supported than they actually are. So he's saying, and this is of course something that we all do all the time, is that we're basically cherry pickers, right? We go out and we hunt systematically for evidence that will make our cherished positions look better. And this is then again a problem not just in evaluating arguments, but also in putting forth your own. Antiquated way of formulating it maybe. Can anybody think of a super modern contemporary application where this type of thing may be affecting us? Think of your search behavior on Google, for instance. What happens? That's not even your fault most of the time. Part of it is, part of it isn't. Yeah?
And like self-diagnosing. You're sick and you're searching up symptoms and thinking of something worse than what it is.
Mm-hmm. Is my head going to explode into green slime because I have a headache? 10,000 or million or whatever results pop up that confirm that, right? So the very never research never try to self-diagnose illness on the internet. We all know that that leads to not very happy conclusions. It's not good for mental health to do this. So one problem is, how are you wording your search terms, right? Even to the point of Google searches, you might be biasing results just by the type of question you're asking. Is there another effect that relates to that? So you can make sure that you word better, more neutral questions that don't bias the answers that come up in that type of search. Well, search engines remember what you've searched for in the past, right? They remember what you like. They remember your personal history. So part of this is being done for us now. So that's just something to keep in mind. Old problem, new application, high tech is making it worse. All right, so that's my side bias. Now let's look at a few more examples of these. A, valid or invalid? Is it valid? Show of hands. Good. So that is valid. B, show of hands. Valid or invalid? Valid? Invalid? Also good. Excellent. C, valid? Invalid? Yeah. And what about the last one? Is this a valid argument or is it not? Is it valid? Invalid? Ha! Now this is the one that makes me really happy because that one is valid, right? Contrary to appearances. So you were good. You're all hypercritical and hyper-skeptical at this point, so you're good at detecting the invalid ones, but a couple of people got messed up and were too critical on the valid ones. And we can see, again, looking at the two invalid examples, you didn't really have trouble with either of them, but it would seem that this one is even easier to spot just because, no, wait a minute, now I'm getting myself mixed up. This one is harder to spot because this one should be harder to spot, and in fact, empirically, it seems to be harder to spot because we accept the premises and the conclusions, but still they have the same form, so they're not valid. But the one that got you mixed up a little bit more was this second one, which many of you thought was invalid, but in fact it was going to be valid. And when we look at these two arguments, we can see that they have exactly the same form, right? They're just saying all A are B, all things that are fish are things that can swim, or all things that have four legs are things that are dangerous. Then it's identifying an individual that either belongs to group A in this first example, or in the second example, identifying a group of individuals that does not belong to group B. So these are both valid forms. But it's just also easier to spot, and I think that was the problem when we also accept the conclusion. So soundness is different from validity. That makes sense? Yeah? Good. So, to sum that up, we're all naturally misled by our own psychology and judgments of validity. Be careful to keep them apart. And I know that by now I'm kind of preaching to the choir. We've been through this before, but this is really one of the main lessons, not just in this course, but also outside of this course, where you're not, where your validity detectors might not be, or your my-side bias detectors might be not as strongly activated as they are in the context of this unit, right? So remember this when you're doing critical thinking out there in the wild. Assessing validity is often the thing that we don't do with snap judgments. It takes time. It takes stepping back. It takes assessing structure of an argument on its own terms. So often snap judgment, gut feeling is the thing to be skeptical of and to kind of put to the side and carefully consider the structure. And that is the thing that, that will hopefully then lead you to the right answer. Okay, so that said, if at least something here got you messed up, then I've hopefully convinced you that we want those cookie cutter recipes for generating valid forms, and that it's also quite helpful to know some standard invalid forms, some very standard ways in which arguments are invalid, but that often can still look convincing, right? So that's what we're going to do now, and this is going to be quite technical, but this is kind of a recipe that you can really use from here onwards. So there's going to be stuff, technical terms and technical forms that you're basically going to have to learn by heart in order to really use them, so to really internalize them, and that can be a bit nasty at the beginning and a bit annoying, but it's going to be tremendously helpful. All right, so this type of thing, again, how many people say it's valid? No? Maybe you're still reading. How many people know whether the premises are true? So those are the validity assessments. Good. How many people know whether the premises are true on this? Does anybody know? Thing about this is going to be you don't really need to know, right? You don't need to know that at all. If the premises were true, this would definitely be a valid form, just because of the way it's constructed here, and that's because it has exactly this form, and that's something we have encountered before as well. So A is taller than B, B is taller than C, therefore A is taller than C. There is absolutely no counterexample or no way in which this might not hold. And often it's easier to see this when you use exactly this kind of schematic abbreviation for it. So that's why we do it. Again, it's a bit nitpicky perhaps at the beginning, but it really makes it obvious when an argument fits that standard structure. Okay, so what about this one? Right? Nobody has a clue, I predict, what this argument is even saying, right? Completely unclear. If you have the feeling that you know what's going on here, I would not believe you, as a matter of fact, right? This is still a deductively valid argument, right? It's still exactly the same thing what we saw before, right? It's pure structure, it's pure recipe without adding in any ingredients, if you want, right? So it has exactly the same structure, so it's still going to work. And obviously, again, this is an attractive skill because it allows you to assess arguments even if you don't know much about the content that is going on in the background. Okay, so what does it mean to say that an argument has a deductively valid form? And this is just, again, a bit the summary of what we've been doing already, kind of to go back to this slide for a standard definition. Again, there is no way that any such argument could lead from true premises to a false conclusion. The premises, whenever they are true, also make the conclusion true because of the way they are connected. So that's just the general cookie cutter answer that we'll use for that. And again, we can use these diagrams to kind of make progress on that, right? Or to kind of visualize this type of thing. We've already worked with that a little bit in the tutorials, where you would just visualize it in exactly this way, all A are B. You can see that if that is said, A is actually a subgroup of B. B, however, is a subgroup of C, a smaller proportion a small proportion of C's are also B and A falls in that proportion, so the argument is automatically clear. And just use these different ways of visualizing it for yourself. Different people learn in different ways, just to make that, just to make sure that you really have that internalized. Now here's one that won't work. And this is basically also the way to detect whether a form is not working, and that's to figure out a counterexample. That is, any example that will have true premises what will lead to a false conclusion. So this is one of the main techniques here. And here's that kind of a counterexample, right? So two true premises, all cats are animals and all dogs are also animals. But it does not follow, obviously, that all cats are dogs. If this kind of thing is going on, this type of form cannot be valid, right? That's not a good form, no matter whether it has an argument of that form has a true conclusion or not. Yeah? All right. So, if we look at this one, again, valid, invalid. How many people say it's valid? Yeah. Invalid. Any takers? Nope. Okay, so that's what we had just now, but it's not sound, right? So it's not a sound argument, obviously. It has one false premise. The next question then is this a counterexample, though? Because if it's a valid form, this shouldn't be happening. So now we're just making a bit of progress on a counterexample. Does this work as a counterexample to this valid form, this model of validity that I've just been advertising to you? Does anybody have an idea? Yeah? Yeah. So for really good counterexample, and this is my roundabout way of telling you what a good counterexample is, all premises have to be true, right? And that is when you can generate a good counterexample. If you have this, it doesn't function as a real counterexample to a valid form. And the idea is going to be that for a valid form, you're never, ever, ever going to find that type of a true counterexample that doesn't, that has two false premises leading to a true conclusion. So that's just to keep in mind, what is a counterexample and how do you generate one? This does not qualify. Yeah? Okay. So now we get a bit more technical. And this is going to give you how many people have heard of these, like modus ponens, modus tollens, affirming the consequent? Yeah. So those are some standard terms that we're just going to use as abbreviation because they're kind of practical and because they're the longer non-Latin version. The way that affirms by affirming is a bit of a mouthful, so that's not something that we want to be using. We've seen countless examples of this, right? I'm not going to read it out anymore. If A, then B, A, therefore B, that always, always works. It has no counterexamples. And we call it modus ponens. And the idea here is that you can always affirm the first thing in the first. So we have our conditional premise, if A, then B. And what is always okay is affirming the first of those two things, the first half of the conditional statement, A. That can be affirmed, and that will lead to a true conclusion. And here's the universal version of that, right? It doesn't always have an if-then structure either. It can sometimes have this kind of a structure where you have all A are B, right? All dogs are mammals. All drummers are real musicians, whatever. Here the form is a little bit different, but really just superficially, right? So now we have exactly the same thing, all A are B, X, which is what we're going to use for an individual, such as Pete, belonging to group A, being a drummer. Therefore, he also belongs to group B. He's also a musician, given that the argument is constructed in that way. Yeah? So those are going to be the standard ways of reconstructing that. And again, you can see that it's just the first thing being affirmed. This is fulfilled, so the second thing is also fulfilled. So that's one of the probably most frequent and powerful standard forms that you immediately commit to memory. And here's where it doesn't work. Affirming always only works for the first thing. It never, ever works for the second thing, right? And this could have a universal version as well. And in fact, I've mixed them up on the slide, as I can now see, right? So this could be the if A, then B, if, I don't know, if a person is a drummer, then that person is also a real musician, whatever, it doesn't really matter. In both of those cases, the second thing is being affirmed. Pete is a real musician. X is B, it would have to say here. And from there, one would conclude X is also A, Pete is also a drummer. And that cannot work, right? That doesn't follow. And this example actually makes it easy to see why, the way this is set up, obviously he could be, he could play some other instrument. That's not too hard to see. But the message here is you never affirm the second thing. You always affirm the first thing. Otherwise, your argument is invalid. Yeah?
How does that work with the sheep argument from before?
The sheep argument from before. Can you repeat that for me?
Arguments with four legs are dangerous. Sheep are not dangerous, therefore do not have four legs.
Where did I have that? Let me pull that up. Was that? Okay. So here we would have all A are B, right? All things that have four legs are also things that are dangerous. Then sheep we would treat as X. X is not, in fact, dangerous. So X does not have four legs. So that's actually a different one, right? Because we're not affirming the second thing, we're denying the second thing. That's where we get to deny, right? We affirm first and deny later. And sorry I didn't remember that example right off the bat. I kind of have all of these swimming in my head right now. But so that's actually an example of the next thing. So that was the sheep example was different from this thing because we weren't affirming the second part of the conditional, but we were denying the second part of the conditional. And that is what makes all the difference. So you affirm first, but not second, and then you deny later, right? So you all have this wonderful positive life-affirming outlook is the way to remember this. Denying the second thing is also always going to get you a valid argument, yeah? If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. No matter what content you plug into this actual argument, it's always true premises are always, always, always going to lead to true conclusions. And this is what we call modus tollens. And again, it's going to exist in this version, in the conditional version, and it's also going to exist in a universal version, right? So again, we have the beer drinking Germans where this is going to work in exactly the same way, right? All A are B, all Germans drink beer. Then we have an individual who does not drink beer. Call him Luke. Therefore, this person cannot be a German because they definitely all are beer drinkers, right? So if you deny the second thing in an argument, that will mean that the first thing, A, being a German, or missing your plane or whatever has not occurred, and that will always be a valid argument, just as in the sheep case. Yeah? And then trouble arises. You can already expect it. What can you then never do? Can you ever switch this around, deny the first thing? That's the other big no-no, right? That's the other big standard invalid form. You can never confuse this rule. You can never switch this around. So the other thing that is going to systematically give you an invalid argument, and you can kind of see, so that's why I've contrasted them in this way. You can kind of see that this standard form of an invalid argument is actually the mirror image of this one, but it's still extremely misleading, right? You cannot deny the first thing in a valid argument. You cannot deny the antecedent. So if Luke misses his plane, he'll be late for the meeting. He's not late, so he can't have missed his plane. There was no other way for him to get there to the meeting. So this is a valid argument. But if you turn it around, say, well, he didn't miss his plane, so he can't have been late. Common sense dictates, yes, there are many other ways that could have occurred. Didn't get a taxi, whatever. Didn't find the meeting, forgot his map, cell phone broke down, whatever, right? So that doesn't follow. So denying the first thing isn't going to lead necessarily to a true conclusion. There could be counterexamples to this claim. So that's what you never do. Yeah? Good. And I'm just repeating it again and again because it's really important that you get those points. Yeah?
If Luke misses his plane, he will be late for his meeting. But couldn't he use something else to get there?
Sure, and we don't even know where the meeting is, right? He might have a very fast car. He might have a helicopter, space shuttle, numerous things. What does that do to the argument?
Makes the argument not valid, doesn't it?
Well,
I mean,
that's a way of criticizing it. Nah, he could have gotten there some other way.
Shouldn't he say, like, if and only if A, then B?
We'll get to the if and only if in a second. That's a bit tricky. Yeah.
If it says if he misses his plane, he'll be late for the meeting. If we just assume that's true, that must mean that it's in the likelihood not being late for his meeting.
So we're pretending that was true. Jamie, you had also raised your hand. Yeah, same thing. So that's the tricky thing about keeping validity and truth apart for now. That could be wrong, completely right. We might not need to accept that. That would make the argument unsound if you can make a good case for how he could have made it if that first conditional did not hold. But when we're playing the validity game, we're just being naive and gullible insofar as the truth of that first premise is concerned. So really try to keep that apart. And I think all of us naturally, so I'm really thankful for that question, right? Because all of us naturally kind of tend to start thinking, but isn't there some other way, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of immediately what sets in. Insofar as validity is concerned, that doesn't matter, right? We just accept that. And if it was true, then the conclusion was also true. So we kind of have to keep those two cognitive tasks, validity assessment and truth assessment, apart, right? So that's also why these weird, absurd arguments can be valid, because that has nothing to do with truth. Yeah? Okay. So, I think we can maybe skip this one for reasons of time, so that's just a bit of an example. And here we get exactly to the if and only if thing that you will sometimes see. So here's a bit of a weird example. Tells us what we already know. If you pass the unit in critical thinking, or let's say Sally, because I don't assume that any of you would actually do this. If I would like to be informed, it could be quite entertaining, right? Then this person will do the tap dance on St. Kilda Pier. There she is tap dancing. Well, so did she pass? Not necessarily. We only knew that she would tap dance if she did pass, but there might be other reasons to get her doing the dance, so that's not news. The weird thing happens if we have something like this, and you might sometimes see this. Has anybody seen this before? So philosophers quite like this, right? And it's not a typo, if with two Fs, if and only if. And that works a little bit differently. So that is a biconditional use of if, and not just a conditional use. In this case, if we see her tap dancing on St. Kilda Pier, then she definitely passed that exam, because that was the only way, she had specified this before, that she was going to engage in penguin costume tap dancing behavior on the pier. So here are the two uses. The conditional if means if A, then B. If we have something like if and only if with two Fs, then it goes in both directions, right? Then it is if A, then B, and if B, then A. And if we have that, then the bit about affirming the consequent is off the table. Then you can do, then it goes in both of those directions. So this is just to say you won't be needing much of this here, but if you ever see this type of if and only if, that suddenly changes the whole logical structure. That's those two conditionals ruled up into the same one. So just so you kind of have that in the background, so if you see it, you know what's going on there. Okay? Okay. So, here are a couple more. Again, this one is one you've already seen, right? This form is familiar by now, right? Either A or B, not A, therefore B. And the only trick to keep in mind here really is that for the purposes of this type of argument, we're just going to be pretending or accepting or assuming that the choice given in the first premise is exhaustive, that there are no further alternatives. That's what it logically means. If that's what we assume, then it always leads to true conclusions, and we call it a disjunctive syllogism. So just to give you that term. And one other thing to say here, I've been pounding the point about order. First, affirming the first thing, denying the second thing, but never the other way around. For the disjunctive syllogism, order doesn't matter, right? So you can flip around the order in this one as much as you want. It's still going to work, right? So it's not as sensitive to order as modus ponens and modus tollens are. And again, that's fairly intuitive, but just to not breed confusion on this point. Yeah? And again, you can imagine many more complex cases where you would have long chains of this type of thing, right? And where you would start doing detective work, trying to identify whether all of these or even longer elements are fulfilled or not fulfilled, right? And that would still, in all of those cases, always be the same form. So it would always be a disjunctive syllogism. And if you had ruled out all possibilities but one, then that last one remaining would be the true conclusion. Yeah? Okay. Then I have one more And this is also one that we've already seen. We already had one in the very first argument cut-up example in the first week. If A, then B, if B, then C, therefore A, then C, the hypothetical syllogism that actually just works with these kind of conditional statements and doesn't really affirm any specific fact at all. And this is also always in this form of valid argument. It just kind of makes a connection actually between the first half of the first conditional statement and the second half of the second conditional statement. And again, you can also imagine that there would be long, long rows of this, right? That this process could be endless. And again, I'm not going to be reading it out. But here you could basically create a connection between the first half of the first premise and the second half of the second premise to get that kind of a conclusion. So that's the kind of thing where you can just have endless chains and very easily still see whether or not they're valid. Yeah? Okay. Couple of things. So here's where I get nitpicky again, but these are slides to go back to for assessment task preparation, and also slides to go back to when you're then preparing for the final exam. Step 1, commit those typical valid and invalid forms to memory. And that's also going to be a lot of what we're doing in the tutorials then this week. Then isolate the form. Leave in logical words like if, then, some, all, and so on and so forth. And substitute everything else with letters. Typically A, B, you might want to use something different. All Melburnians live in Victoria, all M are V, for instance, and so on and so forth. I do recommend working with A and B just because that brings us closer to the cookie cutter forms and might make your life easier in consequence. Then you see whether the form corresponds to one of the standard forms that we've learned here. And again, that's easiest to see if you put the if-then or the all A or B sentence in the first line rather than in the second line. You can still see it, obviously, if you start by saying X is B and all A are B, right? Obviously, that also works. It's just easier to see if you keep it in the order that we've been using here. You can consider whether counterexamples exist, all true premises, not just one true and one false, but all true premises leading to a false conclusion. If not, the argument is deductively valid. So those are the steps, and there's going to be more advice that is informed by typical mistakes that I have seen people make and that I hope no one in this unit makes in this semester, because you're just losing points that you don't need to be losing. The next important thing to see for this type of thing is that when you've identified the logical form and replace the letters, all, M, R, V, whatever, and have something like this and now don't know what to do with it, you also need to have a schematic key, right? You also have to say very carefully what those letters are going to stand for. And that's another area where people lose points on assignment tasks that they don't have to lose. So that's why I'm going to summarize this a bit. So say we have this type of an argument. All M are V, all M are A, therefore V, all V are A. And say we didn't know whether or not that was going to be valid. So we wanted to find a counterexample. Two true premises leading to a false conclusion. So which of these possible substitutions was going to do that work? Maybe I'll just let you look for a second longer. Does anyone else have an idea what that might be? So in case of doubt, you would have to slowly read it out. Any other people who want to talk to me at this point? I have my usual suspect. B. So all cats are animals. That seems to be true. All cats are mammals. That also seems to be true. So all animals are mammals. Yeah. That is right, but that's not what we're looking for, right? Ah, right. Oh, goodness. See, now you're getting me completely. Sometimes you get this kind of lecture blindness when you're standing in front of a group. So that was the correct answer. And sometimes I think lecturing and thinking are a type of multitasking that don't always work. That doesn't always work. So that was the right answer, right? That leads to a false, obviously leads to a false conclusion, so that would be our counterexample. And that's exactly the way that kind of thing works, so thank you. Another thing you don't want to do is something like this, and I'm not conflicted about putting it up there. The reason I'm putting it up there is because I have seen this type of thing many times. This is just something you don't do. You don't create new forms that deviate or mix up elements of the standard forms that I've given you in any way like this, because that just will not make me happy and it won't work very well, right? So just remember, this is an absolute, this type of thing is an absolute no-go. Yeah. Let me see. Another thing I don't want to see, and we're almost done, but again, this is just trying to prevent you from losing points. When you're substituting in the schematics key, when you're saying what your A and what your B stands for, you also don't do something like this. You also don't just mix it all up into one sentence and then copy in what your key stands for, right? That's not what I'm looking for. I really want it to be in a cleaner version, because that's going to help determine or actually help identify the structure. And the other thing that you don't do, and this comes then again back to the question of what you do, but you do not just copy in the whole premise by saying A and B and then saying the whole sentence is what A stands for. Why don't you do that? Because if you did that and read out what your argument now meant, it would not make any sense whatsoever, right? It would be gibberish. So that's something you want to avoid. Again, just go back to those and please remember it so I don't have to deduct points for any of these things. So what do you do? This is the type of thing you do. You have it all on a separate line. Nicely formatted the way we have it on the slides. There's also going to be a PDF with the standard cookie cutter forms that you can download and print and learn by heart and use for help. So that's going to go up on Moodle after the tutorials, and you'll see why later on today or tomorrow. So this is the kind of thing I'm looking for. If you then substituted it in and read it out, that would be an argument that made perfect sense. Okay? And typically we'll use the lowercase letter x for individuals. Yeah? So this is what I do want you to do. Here's another one, another common one that is not good to do, for instance, for x using c. Seems to be something that we would like to do. Why would one not want to use this? Substitute in C for X, in this case for Rome's political system, in this argument. Why might that not be a good idea? We have just two of them, and then we suddenly have confusion between the conclusion and what C stands for. So again, that's something you want to avoid. All right. So that's my final word to the wise about do's and don'ts. Again, just being nitpicky because I want you to avoid mistakes. This is another example for you to look at home about how this can work. For reasons of time, I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to say what I wanted to show by it, and then we're done. Make sure that your key, when you do this type of substitution, actually fits in with the form of the argument that you're reconstructing. So here you're going to see there are two different ways of reconstructing this argument, and each of those is going to need a different schematic key, right? So we're out of time, so I can't go through it. Look at it, but you'll see why it's really important to do this cleanly. Okay, so then we're done for now. Thanks, and I'll see you in the toots.